I felt like moving back in and giving her the time to figure it out was a solid compromise. After months of emotional turmoil, nights of uncertainty, and an overwhelming sense of confusion, I found myself at a crossroads in my marriage. My heart was caught in a delicate balance between love and pain. The emotional scars left by the years of tension and instability ran deep, but somewhere beneath the rubble, I still cared for her, maybe too much. It wasn't that I didn't see the signs of dysfunction, the ways in which we had both lost ourselves in the aftermath of everything. But there was still something, some thread of connection that made me hesitate. When she suggested that maybe a separation would give us both the clarity we needed, I had agreed, albeit reluctantly. It wasn't the first time we'd hit this point, but this time it felt different. I felt like we were standing at a precipice, staring down into a vast unknown. The idea of letting go entirely scared me more than anything. I tried to imagine life without her, without the shared memories, without the future I had envisioned with her, and it felt like losing a part of myself. But as I moved into a small apartment nearby, with the intention of giving her space to think, I found myself lost. It wasn't the physical absence of her that bothered me, it was the void left by the emotional distance. The silence that now filled the space we once shared felt like a constant reminder of the things we hadn't said, the words we had swallowed, and the unresolved issues that still lingered like a dark cloud between us. The apartment, though small and functional, was a far cry from the home we had built together. It was quiet, almost painfully so, and I found myself staring at the walls, missing the familiar chaos of our life. Days turned into weeks, and my thoughts were consumed by the idea of her. I knew that she had her own struggles, her own turmoil, but I couldn't stop wondering if she was missing me as much as I missed her. I tried to focus on myself, to take this time to figure out who I was outside of the relationship, but it felt like I was going through the motions. There was a heaviness in my chest, an ache that never seemed to dissipate. Every time I returned to the house to gather more of my things, the memories hit me like waves, our laughter, our fights, the quiet evenings spent together. It was all still there, lingering in the corners, making it impossible to escape the life we had shared. Then, one evening, I found myself sitting in my car outside the house, watching the lights flicker in the window. I hadn't planned to come over, but something inside me urged me to do so. Maybe it was the hope that seeing her again would bring some clarity, or maybe it was the nagging sense that I wasn't ready to let go. As I sat there, the weight of the decision hit me harder than ever. The thought of permanently walking away, of ending everything, seemed too much to bear. I had always believed in the idea of compromise, of meeting in the middle. I told myself that maybe what we needed was not to separate further, but to find a way back to each other slowly. Maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild the foundation we had once had. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't expecting everything to change overnight, but I believed that if we could just give it time to heal, to reflect, and to understand each other again, maybe there was still hope. So, I made the decision. I reached out to her, telling her that I wanted to come back, but under the condition that we both took things slow. No expectations, no pressure, just two people trying to find their way back to one another, one step at a time. I convinced myself that this was a solid compromise, giving her the time and space she needed to figure things out, but also taking the chance to rebuild what we had, without rushing into anything. The night I returned, I could feel the weight of the decision settling in, like a new chapter opening in a book I wasn't sure I was ready to read. I moved back in quietly, as if testing the waters, and sure of what to expect. The house felt different, emptier in a way that I couldn't describe. There was a subtle tension in the air, but also a sense of something fragile, something worth salvaging. We both tiptoed around each other, unsure of how to act, unsure of what to say. There were moments of silence, awkwardness, and uncertainty, but in between those moments, there were flashes of the connection we once shared. A look, a gesture, a quiet smile. The intimacy that had once been effortless now felt strained, but I didn't mind. I knew that rebuilding was a slow process, and I was willing to take it one day at a time. But as time went on, I realized that the compromise I had made moving back in, offering her the space to figure things out, was not as simple as I had hoped. There were days when I felt closer to her than ever, and then days when the distance between us seemed insurmountable. We had both changed in ways we hadn't anticipated, and the dynamics of our relationship had shifted. I found myself questioning whether I had made the right choice. Was I just prolonging the inevitable? Or was this a genuine opportunity for healing? It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to watch her struggle with her own demons, to see the weight of her own internal battles affect our relationship. It wasn't easy to confront the fact that we had both failed each other in so many ways, but I couldn't ignore the small moments of progress, the times when we could laugh again, when we could talk openly without the walls we had built around ourselves. Those moments, though fleeting, reminded me that perhaps we still had a chance. But as the weeks wore on, I began to realize something. The more I gave, the more I compromised, the more I began to lose myself. The person I had been before, the person who was strong, confident, and capable of standing on his own, was slipping away. I wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I had started to depend on her more than I ever should have. I had allowed myself to lose my voice in the name of compromise, in the hope that things would get better. And that's when I knew compromise wasn't enough. Compromise wasn't a solution when it came at the cost of my own happiness, my own sense of self-worth. I had allowed the space for her to figure things out, but in doing so, I had neglected to take care of my own needs. I had allowed myself to fall back into a situation where I wasn't being true to who I was, where I was still searching for validation and hope from someone who couldn't give it to me in the way I needed. The realization hit hard, like a sudden gust of wind that knocked the breath out of me. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness for the hope of something that might never come. The compromise had been a well-intentioned attempt to heal, but it was no longer enough. The time had come for me to stand up for myself, to recognize that healing could only begin when both people were willing to meet halfway, and at that moment, I wasn't sure if she was. I took a deep breath, and sure of what would come next, but certain that whatever it was, it had to come from within me. It was time for me to let go of the hope that things could be the way they once were. It was time to find my own path, to rediscover who I was outside of the relationship. And as much as it hurt, as much as it scared me to face the reality, I knew it was the only way forward. As the days stretched on, I found myself at an impasse. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, one where emotions tangled and unresolved tension lingered in the air like a thick fog. I could feel myself slipping further away from the person I once was, from the person I knew I needed to be. The compromise of returning, of giving her space to figure things out, had become a delicate balancing act, but I was no longer sure if we were moving towards something better, or if we were simply delaying the inevitable. I spent hours thinking about what was happening, about how we had arrived at this point. My mind circled through the past early days when we first met, when everything had seemed so easy, so full of promise. I tried to hold on to those memories, but they were fading, blurred by the weight of what we had become. The early spark, the joy, had been replaced by suspicion, frustration, and a growing sense of disconnection. We were two people who had drifted so far apart that the very act of standing side by side felt foreign. It wasn't just her I was losing myself. The man who had once stood confidently, who had valued his own space and independence, was now paralyzed by the fear of rejection. I was constantly questioning myself, doubting my worth, second-guessing every move I made. Every effort I put in, every attempt to reconnect, seemed to only highlight the growing chasm between us. I knew she was struggling too. There were moments when I saw her face soften, when I could glimpse the woman I had once loved so deeply. But those moments were fleeting. The walls she had built up, the layers of fear and insecurity, seemed unbreakable. I had no idea how to reach her anymore. How do you reach someone who is so lost within themselves that they can no longer see the person right in front of them? How do you love someone who can't love themselves? I tried to fill the emptiness with distractions. I focused on work, on keeping busy, on anything that would allow me to escape the heaviness in my heart. But no matter how much I kept myself occupied, it didn't change the fact that I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. I had come back, thinking that the space would give us clarity, thinking that time apart would allow us to heal. But now, I was questioning everything. Was I just prolonging the inevitable, or was there still a way out of the dark and back into the light? One evening, after another long and exhausting day, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The house was eerily quiet, and I realized that it had been that way for weeks. The silence between us had become deafening. I could hear my thoughts more clearly now, louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall. My heart was heavy, filled with a sadness I had never expected to feel. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to make it right. But I didn't know how anymore. I was emotionally drained, worn down by the constant cycle of hope and disappointment. I couldn't tell if the love I still felt for her was enough to carry us through, or if it was simply the last remnants of a dream that had long since shattered. In that moment of quiet reflection, I realized that my approach had been wrong. I had been trying to hold on, trying to fight for something that no longer existed. The more I tried to force things, the more distant she became. I had been giving her space to figure things out, but I hadn't allowed myself the same luxury. I hadn't given myself the room to step back and see the situation for what it truly was. I couldn't keep living in a state of limbo. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness, my own peace of mind, in the hope that someday things would miraculously get better. It wasn't fair to either of us. I realized that I needed to face the truth both for her and for myself. I had allowed this marriage to become a one-sided effort, where I carried the weight of trying to fix everything, while she, lost in her own struggles, had pulled further and further away. I needed to give both of us the chance to breathe, to reflect, and to understand if we were still the same people who had fallen in love. If not, then I needed to accept that our paths had diverged and that, perhaps, the best way forward was to let go. The thought of leaving, of stepping away for good, caused a deep ache in my chest. But I knew that holding on out of fear or habit wouldn't bring either of us happiness. In the silence that followed, I made the decision. I would give her the space to find herself, just as I had to find myself. But this time, I would take that space too, not just physically, but emotionally. I had to allow myself the grace to heal, to rediscover who I was without the weight of this relationship holding me back. And though it felt like tearing a part of myself away, I knew it was the only way forward. There was no shame in acknowledging that sometimes love wasn't enough to fix everything. There was no shame in walking away if it meant saving both of us from a future of resentment and regret. The next few days were a blur. I packed my things, not in a rush, but with a quiet certainty. There was a sadness in the air, an unspoken understanding that things would never be the same. I wasn't angry with her, and I didn't want to blame her. I simply knew that we were the people who had lost their way, and it was time to let go. When I left, I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to stay in something that wasn't working. And as I stepped out the door for the last time, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was ready to face it. On my own, the days after I left were a blur of emotions: relief, guilt, sadness, and a strange sense of freedom I didn't quite expect. I had walked away, but the echoes of our life together lingered, haunting every corner of my thoughts. I had left the house, left the woman I had once loved so deeply, but something still tethered me to the past. The weight of my decision pressed heavily on my chest, but the quiet space I now had allowed me to think more clearly than I had in years. The apartment I moved into was small and modest, a temporary home for someone who was still figuring out who they were after so much of their identity had been tangled up in a marriage. I wasn't sure what I expected from this new chapter of my life. The world outside seemed to move on, as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything felt different. I felt like a stranger in my own life. In those first few weeks, I found myself questioning everything. Had I made the right decision? Had I been too quick to walk away? Maybe, if I had tried harder, been more patient, things could have turned out differently. I replayed the moments, her angry outbursts, the times I felt ignored, the silent treatment that had stretched on for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had been too hasty. I wondered if there was another way, another possibility for us to have worked through it. But then, I'd remind myself of the emotional toll it had taken on me. I had lost pieces of myself in the process of trying to keep the peace, of trying to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. But the real struggle wasn't in questioning my decision, it was in confronting the truth about myself. I had spent so long in the marriage focused on her needs, on making her happy, that I had forgotten about my own. I had neglected my own well-being, my own emotional health, because I had convinced myself that being there for her was enough. But it hadn't been, and I realized now that I had to find my own strength again. I spent my days focusing on small things, cooking simple meals, reading books I had been too distracted to finish, going on long walks through the city to clear my mind. Slowly, I started to rebuild a sense of independence, a sense of myself that didn't revolve around someone else. But even in those small moments of peace, there was a gnawing ache in my heart. I missed her. I missed the parts of her that had once been the reason I fell in love with her, the warmth in her smile, the way she would laugh with me about the silliest things, the little gestures of care that we had once shared so easily. But I also knew that the relationship we had, the one we had tried so desperately to maintain, had taken a toll on both of us. We had been two people trying to change for each other, trying to make something work that wasn't meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, I started to find some semblance of peace. I began to accept that I had made the right decision, even if it hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, of course, but in the stillness of my new life, I was learning to listen to myself again, to trust myself. The person I had been before the marriage was still there, buried beneath all the pain and heartache, and slowly, I was bringing him back to life. I stopped checking in on her, stopped wondering what she was doing, who she was seeing. It wasn't out of anger or resentment, it was out of necessity. I needed to stop holding on to the past, to stop searching for closure from someone who wasn't able to give it to me. It was time to close that chapter for good and to let go. There were moments when I thought of her, when memories would rush back, and I would feel that familiar longing. But it was different now. I had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough to fix everything. Love couldn't heal all wounds, couldn't erase all the mistakes we had made. And I had learned, perhaps too late, that I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for someone else's happiness. As I started to let go of her, I began to see the possibility of something more. A future that didn't include the constant fear of being judged or the burden of feeling like I wasn't enough. It was a future where I could be myself again, where I could build something from the ground up, with no one but myself to rely on. And yet, there were still moments, even in the midst of my growth, when I would catch myself wondering what could have been. Would things have been different if I had been stronger from the beginning? If I had demanded more respect, more communication, more of myself from the relationship? But the answers never came, and I had to accept that some questions were never meant to be answered. The past was a place I could no longer live in, and the future was waiting for me to step forward into it. Months passed, and the pain, though still present, was no longer as sharp. I learned to cherish the quiet moments, the times I could sit in solitude without feeling lonely. I learned that I was worthy of love, but that love had to start with myself. And as I moved through each day, I began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The decision I had made, the one that had seemed so painful and impossible at the time, had opened the door to a future I hadn't imagined for myself. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. And as I stood on the other side of the pain, I realized that sometimes, letting go wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I began to feel a sense of quiet restoration. The rawness of the breakup had dulled, and although I still carried the scars, I was starting to see them in a new light. They weren't just reminders of a broken marriage, but proof that I had survived, that I had endured, and in some strange way, those scars were now part of my strength. I didn't need to forget what had happened to heal from it. I needed to acknowledge it, accept it, and learn from it. The silence between us had become less suffocating. The emotional chaos that had once defined our relationship now felt distant, like a storm that had passed. I began to realize just how much energy I had poured into trying to fix something that wasn't meant to be fixed. The exhaustion that had clouded my thoughts for so long was finally lifting. I started seeing the world through a clearer lens, noticing things I had once overlooked: the beauty of quiet moments, the joy of solitude, that feeling of finally breathing freely without the weight of guilt and uncertainty hanging over me. I began to reclaim parts of myself I had lost over the years. I rediscovered hobbies I'd neglected. I found comfort in cooking, something I had always enjoyed but had pushed aside while I was wrapped up in the stress of our failing marriage. The act of creating a meal, the focus it required, brought me peace in a way I hadn't expected. It was a small but powerful reminder that I could still create beauty in my life, even when things seemed out of control. In the midst of all this healing, I found myself starting to wonder about the future. I hadn't been ready for anything or anyone romantically speaking since the breakup. The idea of opening my heart to someone again felt like an overwhelming thought. But I could feel the faint stirrings of hope beginning to creep in. I wasn't sure what form that hope would take, but I could feel it growing inside me, a quiet belief that I could love again, but only when I was ready. There were still days when loneliness would creep in, moments when I would feel the empty spaces in my life more acutely than others. I missed the companionship of someone I could share my day with, the intimacy of having someone who truly knew me. But even in those moments, I realized that the longing didn't feel like desperation anymore. It was simply a natural part of the process. I was learning to be okay with being alone, not because I had to be, but because I had come to appreciate it. I didn't need anyone to fill the gaps in my life. I had learned to do that myself. One evening, after a particularly reflective day, I sat at my kitchen table, the soft light from the lamp casting a warm glow around the room. The silence was comforting now, no longer oppressive. I ran my fingers across the edge of the table, thinking about how far I had come. I had been broken, but I was rebuilding. Slowly, but surely, I was rebuilding. The emotional wounds still hurt from time to time, but they no longer defined me. I didn't have to carry the burden of someone else's unhappiness anymore. I had finally come to understand that my own happiness was something I had to choose for myself. I had chosen to walk away, to take back control, and though it had been the hardest decision of my life, it was also the most empowering. I thought about her, how she was doing, what she might be going through, if she was healing too. There were still moments when I wondered if she was as lost as I had been, or if she had found her own way. But those thoughts were fleeting now. The answers didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was that I had found a way to move forward. I had realized that my worth wasn't tied to our marriage or to her approval. I had always been worthy of love, of peace, of happiness. I didn't need to be validated by anyone but myself. I had to stop looking for answers from a past that could never give them to me. I had to look forward, to embrace the possibility of a new beginning, one step at a time. And as the days turned into months, I knew that I was no longer the person who had walked out of that house in search of peace. I was someone new, someone who had learned to stand on his own, to face the world not with fear but with a quiet confidence. I wasn't fully healed, and I wasn't perfect, but I had found a strength within myself that I hadn't known existed. It was a long road ahead, but I knew one thing for sure: I was ready for whatever came next, whatever that looked like. Whether it was healing from the past or finding love again, I would face it with a clearer heart and a stronger sense of self. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself.